You're standing in your brother's driveway on a Saturday afternoon, helping him load a mattress into a rented truck for his move to a smaller apartment across town, and neither of you has said a single word about why the move is happening, even though you both know exactly why. Theos' business, the small woodworking shop he's run for 11 years, hasn't recovered from a slow 2 years the way either of you had hoped it would. You, meanwhile, took a position at a logistics firm 6 years ago that's paid you considerably more than either of you ever expected, a fact that sat quietly between you at every family gathering since, never once spoken aloud, both of you performing an easy, uncomplicated version of brotherhood that neither of you has ever fully examined. You lift one end of the mattress, he lifts the other. You talk about the Cardinals game from the night before, about a mutual friend's new baby, about anything except the actual reason he's downsizing from a 2-bedroom to a studio at 34 years old. The truck gets loaded, you drive separately to the new place, and you help him carry everything up 2 flights of stairs, and at no point does either of you mention the number sitting quietly in your own accounts that could resolve his entire situation in a single conversation neither of you seems willing to start. The levels don't feel like levels when you're inside them. Everything eventually just becomes Saturday. Your friend Petra and her sister Ilsa handled a similar gap differently years earlier, and it took the family the better part of a decade to fully understand what their handling of it actually cost. Petra's sister Ilsa built a successful dental practice, while Petra's own bakery struggled for most of a decade, staying afloat but never quite thriving, always one bad month away from a real problem. And Ilsa, once the gap between the two sisters became impossible to ignore, didn't manage it quietly. She managed it loudly, the way people manage things they haven't fully thought through, paying for Petra's daughter's braces without asking first, showing up to family gatherings with expensive, pointed gifts for Petra specifically, mentioning once, at a birthday dinner, that Petra should just let her invest in the bakery properly instead of struggling along like this. Petra said yes to the investment, eventually, worn down less by the offer itself than by the accumulated weight of a decade of smaller gestures that had already established, long before any paperwork existed, that Ilsa was the sister who could afford to help and Petra was the one who needed it. The investment came with terms this time, actual terms, a genuine ownership stake in the bakery in exchange for the capital, reasonable on paper, and yet the moment it was signed, something in the relationship between the two sisters shifted permanently. Every decision about the bakery now had 2 votes in the room instead of 1, and one of those votes belonged to someone who'd never worked a single shift behind the counter. Ilsa financed this involvement the same way she financed most of her own visible life, comfortably, without much strain on her own finances, because her income could genuinely absorb it. That was never the problem. The problem was what the investment did to the sisterhood underneath the business relationship, the specific and permanent shift in how the two women related to each other afterward. Petra stopped mentioning the bakery struggles at all, even in the ordinary way a business owner mentions a slow month to family, because any mention now risked sounding like she was asking for more. Ilsa started, without quite meaning to, treating certain decisions about the bakery, the menu, the hours, whether to open a second location, as though her vote counted for more, because in a very literal, contractual sense, it now did. This is the first quiet truth underneath everything that follows. The loud handling of a wealth gap and the careful handling of one are almost never the same strategy, and the loud version, however well-intentioned, tends to calcify the gap into something structural rather than dissolving it. Ilsa wanted her investment to fix something between her and her sister. It didn't fix anything. It just gave the gap a legal shape everyone in the family could now see, permanently, at every gathering afterwards, whether anyone wanted to see it or not. At a family dinner years into this arrangement, Petra mentions to you, half joking, that she doesn't understand how you and Theo have kept things so simple between you, given the gap she's heard vaguely referenced over the years. You tell her you're not entirely sure either. You don't mention that the actual answer is that neither you nor Theo has ever let the other one see the full shape of the gap between you, precisely because you'd both, separately and without ever discussing it, watched what happened to Petra and Ilsa closely enough to want no part of it. Ilsa isn't a villain in this story, and it would be easy for the comparison to sound like one, which isn't the intention. She's doing something almost everyone in her position is quietly encouraged to do, treating a formal investment as the responsible, grown-up version of helping a struggling sibling, without ever fully working through what a contractual stake in someone's livelihood actually does to the relationship underneath the business relationship. She wanted the equity arrangement, the braces paid for, without asking. the pointed birthday gifts, to arrive at a conclusion about the two of them being close before anyone had to do the work of asking whether the structure itself was quietly reorganizing the sisterhood around who had the power to say no. You and Theo never once needed a signed agreement to prove anything to each other, and it isn't a virtue so much as a byproduct of watching, from a careful distance for over a decade, exactly what the alternative costs a family that never quite recovers its original footing. The habit underneath your side of the relationship with Theo, the one that's kept the gap from ever calcifying into anything visible, starts with something almost embarrassingly small. You've never once, in over a decade, let a shared family expense reflect the actual difference in what either of you earns. When you split the cost of your parents' anniversary trip, you split it exactly in half, every single time, regardless of the fact that half means something very different to your budget than it does to his. When you go out to eat as a family, you order roughly what he orders, never once suggest the more expensive bottle of wine or the pricier entree, in a way that would require either explaining why you could afford it or watching him decline something he couldn't. The parity isn't accidental. It's a specific, ongoing choice, made new every time the question comes up, to let the relationship operate on terms that have nothing to do with either of your actual bank balances. This requires a kind of ongoing discipline that has nothing to do with a formal system and everything to do with the same underlying instinct. Noticing, before it happens, the exact moment where a gesture meant to help would actually just make the gap between you visible in a way neither of you could unsee afterwards. You catch yourself, more than once over the years, halfway through composing a text offering to cover his shop's rent for a month during a particularly slow stretch, and you delete it before sending, not because you don't want to help, but because you've watched, at a careful distance, exactly what that kind of help did to Petra and Ilsa. Your wife asks you once, gently, why you don't just tell Theo the actual number, given how close the two of you are, given that he'd probably be genuinely happy for you rather than resentful. You tell her you've thought about it, and that the honest answer isn't that you think he'd be resentful. It's that you don't know what the conversation does to the relationship once it happens, and you're not willing to find out just to satisfy a curiosity neither of you has ever actually voiced. What she understands, having watched this discipline operate for over a decade now, is that the effort to maintain parity in 100 small, ordinary moments, the split trip, the matched order at dinner, the deleted text offering help he never asked for, is, underneath everything, the exact same instinct that Ilsa never developed. The recognition that a wealth gap between siblings doesn't actually need to be managed through gestures at all. It just needs to be kept quiet enough, in enough of the small moments, that it never gets the chance to become the subject of the relationship instead of a fact sitting quietly alongside it. Theo's shop finally hits a genuine crisis point that winter. Not the slow, ordinary struggle of the last 2 years, but an actual emergency. A supplier head relied on for a decade abruptly closes, leaving him with an order half-finished and a client threatening to walk, along with a payment due on his equipment lease that he genuinely can't cover without the client's final payment, which won't arrive until the order's complete, which he can complete without the supplier he no longer has. This is the moment the parity you've maintained for over a decade gets tested for real, not as a hypothetical, but as an actual Tuesday afternoon with your brother facing the possible collapse of an 11-year business and a decision that has to get made quickly, one way or another, about whether and how you get involved. You don't do what Ilsa would have done, you don't offer an equity stake, don't show up with a gesture designed to be noticed, don't turn a Tuesday afternoon emergency into a permanent structural shift in how the two relate to each other or to the business. Instead, you call him and ask what he actually needs, specifically this week, not what would be nice to have long-term, but what gets the current order finished and the client kept. He tells you he needs $4,200 for materials from a new supplier who can deliver by Friday, and that the equipment lease payment is the part he can genuinely handle himself once the client's final payment clears the following week. You send him the $4,200, framed exactly as what it is: a loan with a specific number and a specific expected repayment date once the client pays, written down between the two of you in a 2-line text message that took 30 seconds to send, and that neither of you has ever needed to reference again. He pays you back 3 weeks later, exactly the amount, no interest discussed either way because neither of you brought it up. Neither of you ever mentions it beyond that, not because it's a secret, but because it was never meant to be anything more than exactly what it was. Same storm, entirely different social architecture than the one standing underneath Petra and Ilsa's version of the same kind of moment years earlier. The habit that made the difference here wasn't dramatic in the slightest. It was a decade of never once letting a gesture become bigger than the specific, bounded problem it was meant to solve, which meant that when an actual emergency arrived, there was a template already available for handling it cleanly, without either of you having to invent, under stress, a new kind of relationship neither of you had actually agreed to. There is a man named Augustin, who's been your father's closest friend since college, someone you've known your whole life, mostly as the guy who tells the same 3 stories at every family gathering and always remembers everyone's birthday without needing to be reminded by a calendar app. Augustine has 2 adult sons of his own, a gap between them almost identical in shape to the one between you and Theo. One working as a high school teacher, stable but modest, the other having built something considerably more lucrative, running a small chain of auto repair shops. You ask him once, at one of these same gatherings, how he's watched the two of them navigate it, mostly out of curiosity, rather than any specific concern about your own situation. He tells you the two of them made an agreement early, in their 20s, before either career had fully taken shape, that neither would ever bring up the other's income unless directly asked, and that any financial help between them, if it ever happened, would be treated as a specific, one-time transaction rather than an ongoing arrangement, discussed openly and repaid on agreed terms if repayment made sense, or given outright and never mentioned again if it didn't. He says the agreement sounds almost clinical described out loud, but that it's protected something neither of them could have protected any other way. A friendship between brothers that's never once had to carry the weight of an unspoken debt, or an unacknowledged imbalance sitting quietly underneath every conversation. That's the quiet truth underneath everything Augustin's sons have maintained for over 2 decades, and it's close to the same instinct you and Theo arrived at independently, without ever formalizing it the way Augustin's sons did. The willingness to let a sibling relationship stay exactly the size and shape it was before the money entered the picture, even when the money technically permits something bigger, more generous, more visibly different. Because the moment it doesn't stay that size, you've traded something durable for something that feels good in a single gesture and erodes quietly in every interaction that follows it. He tells you one more thing before the conversation moves on to something else, almost as an afterthought, the same unhurried tone he's used for everything else that afternoon. He says the actual gap in income between his 2 sons has grown considerably larger over the years, not smaller, and that the size of the gap has become almost entirely irrelevant to the relationship, precisely because neither of them ever let the gap become the subject of the relationship in the first place. Theo calls you at 10:40 on a Thursday night, months after the supplier crisis has resolved itself into an ordinary, unremarkable fact of his business history again. And his voice carries a specific strain you recognize immediately. His youngest daughter's been running a fever high enough that his wife's already headed to the emergency room with her. And he's calling you not for money this time, but because he's stuck at the shop finishing an order he can't leave mid-cut without ruining it. And he needs someone to get to the hospital before his wife has to sit alone waiting on test results. You're in your car within 4 minutes. You don't think about money at all, not the $4,200 loan, repaid months earlier, not the general shape of the gap between you that sat quietly unspoken for over a decade, not anything except getting to the hospital as fast as safely possible. The cost of anything that happens that night, the ER visit, whatever tests get run, whatever the bill ends up being, doesn't enter your mind once. It isn't in the car with you at all, not even as a passing shadow. This is the truth every other decision in this story was quietly building toward, and it's the only one that isn't really about money or sibling dynamics at any point. It's about what all those years of split trips and matched dinner orders and a 2-line text loan were actually for underneath everything else. Not Ilsa's equity stake in a bakery, not the specific resentment it eventually produced, not even Augustin's sons and their carefully negotiated agreement about repayment terms. It was always, from some ordinary Saturday over a decade ago, loading a mattress into a rented truck, about keeping a relationship whole enough, undisturbed enough by asymmetry, that when Theo actually needed something real at 10:40 on a Thursday night, he called you specifically because the relationship had never once been reorganized around what either of you had, and you could simply show up, without either of you having to first navigate years of accumulated tension about every gesture before it. That's the highest job money never gets to do inside a sibling relationship, precisely because it was never allowed to try. It doesn't buy status between the two of you. It doesn't buy the specific, hollow warmth Ilsa got from being known as the sister who'd made the investment. It buys the quiet, undisturbed trust in which a real need, when it finally arrives, gets handled without a single second of hesitation about what it means or what it costs, or what it might owe. You sit with your sister-in-law in the ER waiting room until nearly 2 a.m. Your niece eventually diagnosed with nothing more serious than a bad ear infection. Both of you exhausted, both of you relieved, neither of you once mentioning anything about money the entire night, because it was never, at any point, the thing either of you were actually there for. You drive home just before 2:30, and Theo texts you a photo the next morning of his daughter, fever-broken, eating a popsicle on the couch, captioned with nothing more than a single word of thanks. You write back something short and equally understated, and neither of you brings up anything about the previous night beyond that, the same way neither of you brought up the $4,200 loan beyond a two-line text message and a repayment 3 weeks later. Petra and Ilsa are at the next family gathering too, older now, quieter about the bakery than they used to be, the loud generosity of a decade ago having mellowed into something closer to ordinary sisterhood once the two of them finally several years in had the actual conversation neither of them had ever had. A real conversation, with real numbers, that unwound the equity arrangement for good and let them start over on terms that had nothing to do with who could afford what. It took them most of a decade to arrive at something you and Theo built, without ever discussing it, in about a tenth of the time. Money never fixes a sibling relationship. It never repaired the years Petra spent avoiding any mention of the bakery struggles. And it wouldn't have arrived any faster if you and Theo had simply told each other the real numbers at that very first Saturday years ago. It might have changed nothing, or it might have changed everything, and neither of you has ever been willing to find out which. Money doesn't undo what it sets in motion once it enters a relationship loudly. It only decides quietly and years in advance whether the relationship underneath it was ever built to survive the entrance at all. You still haven't told Theo the real number over a decade now from wherever the gap first opened between you. It's because the telling was never the point, and somewhere around Augustin's careful description of his own son's quiet arrangement, you finally understood why. The habits were never really measuring the income gap at all. They were measuring how much room the gap was allowed to take up in a relationship that existed originally for reasons that had nothing to do with either of your paychecks. And now that so little room has ever been given to it, now that the split trips and the matched dinner orders and the bounded two-line text emergency help have all quietly done their work, what fills the space where the number would have gone if either of you had ever let it in the room at all?